If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.
This is Spoiled Fruit, Faith, and Power. In this two-part extended interview, you'll hear from former Vineyard pastor JT Meyer. JT's story is one of deep integrity, painful disillusionment, and a movement that left little room for dissent. In part one, we trace JT's journey into the Vineyard, how he became a pastor committed to both justice and orthodoxy, and what happened when he began to advocate for LGBTQ inclusion. What follows is a raw, honest, and unflinching look at what it means to lead with conviction, only to be punished for it. This interview has not been edited for content. Some material may be difficult to hear. Okay, long time coming, JT. It all started with you, more or less. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah. It's good to be here, man. It's nice to talk to you. Finally, we've had to cancel a bunch of our records. So.
It's okay. I'm glad you're feeling better. So that's the main thing. So JT, you have a different story than anyone I've talked to because you come from, I would say, Vineyard royalty. It runs in the blood of your family. Like I remember before I even met you or even knew who you were, I remember I was going to a Vineyard offshoot here in Columbus. I think Chelsea your sister was preaching that Sunday.
Oh, wow.
It's a family affair. Yeah. So
it sure is.
Talk about your origin story.
Yeah. So I grew up in the church that eventually became Vineyard Columbus. But when I was a little kid, we were at this small church called Christ Community Church, just this little non-denominational church that was loving Jesus and trying to do the local church thing. And I remember like going to these big, huge events that John Wimber was at. And John Wimber was the founder of the Vineyard. But I remember, like, I don't know the details of why we were doing it. I just remember going to it. And the thing I remember is coming home from those events and my parents, like, teaching me and my siblings to, like, pray for one another. And there was this, like, idea that kind of flipped in our heads that, like, God was this, God who was up on a throne that we were worshiping to this God who was drawing near, who interacted with us in a really personal way. So I remember them teaching us how to pray for sick people and saying, actually, we could pray for someone and they could be healed, or we could ask the Holy Spirit to come and the Holy Spirit would actually come. And so from a young age, I think because of these Vineyard conferences and these ideas of becoming the Vineyard, the idea of a relational, knowable, interactive God marked my life. And so I was completely sold out for Jesus and completely sold out for this idea that the Vineyard was really embracing that, like, oh man, we embrace worship and we embrace the presence of God. And I absolutely love church. And I remember when we became a Vineyard, it was like so exciting because it became this thing where we went from this independent church where we were kind of all alone to we're part of this bigger thing. And I would go to these Vineyard conferences in Anaheim and meet all these other pastor kids who were doing the same thing. And like, I began to like just absolutely love being a part of the Vineyard. And so that lasted throughout my teenage years. And then, I was the typical pastor's kid where I went through rebellious, thing. That's a story for a different podcast, maybe. But I remember when I came back to the Lord, like I was like trying to go to all these different churches that were not Vineyards because I was like kind of trying to, carve out my own path and didn't want to live under the shadow of my parents. My parents are Danny and Penny Meyer, and they're like really beloved in the Vineyard. And everywhere I went, people were like, "Oh, you're Danny's son." And I was like, "I just want to be JT." So I was going out to all these different churches, but eventually I found myself back in a Vineyard church. And like me and Jesus had this collision course where like it felt like this thing that I had lost over the past few years just re-grabbed my heart. And I was actually out to breakfast with this guy named Simon. And Simon looked at me and was like, "You're supposed to be a pastor. I want you to help me build this church." And he was like, the hairs on my arm are standing up. And like at that point in my life, I was like just drinking every night and like trying to meet girls and stuff. And it was like within a year, John, I was on staff at that church, going to Vineyard Leadership Institute and like leading worship and preaching and doing all these things. And it was like this snowball effect of like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And so I think what really drew me to the Vineyard was it was within the Vineyard that I really met Jesus. And it was within the Vineyard that I learned to who I was. Like I learned that I love to lead worship and I love to preach and I love to introduce other people to Jesus. And so even though I kind of grew up as a Vineyard baby, the Vineyard like really grabbed my heart. And it was really the idea of we love the church and we love Jesus, and we just want to do this in a really simple and authentic way. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah,
Yeah, good.
absolutely. You clearly, again, similar to my situation where born and raised literally in the church, with dads who were pastors. And in your case, both mom and dad, were pastors. I think it's natural as a pastor's kid to go through that period of time in your life. You're sort of question your beliefs in general because you're like, well, I grew up in it. And from day one, I had to be in church. And
Yeah.
these are the things I was taught and told. And so I think I think it's a natural part of the progression to start to wonder, well, what do I believe? And do I actually want to be here? And ironically, a lot of us do find our way back to where we started. And, oh, I do love this.
Yeah.
So that
Mhm.
that is very cool. And what and I know obviously it's tough growing up under the shadow of Danny and Penny Meyer, as you said, just super beloved members of society around here, like just great reputations. And I remember the first time I had a conversation with your dad. I think we were at your daughter's birthday party or something one
Yeah.
year when you guys down here. Danny, comes from that old school group of Vineyard pastors, and so from a theological perspective, probably a little bit more conservative in that way. I remember that the mark he left on me was the fact that I had just started the Deconstructionist podcast. So obviously
Mhm.
really dipping our toes into some progressive ideas, and we had this awesome conversation in the kitchen, and he was so open to listening to what I had to say, even though I knew I'm like, he probably doesn't agree with any of this, but was so cool about it and genuinely interested in hearing what I had to say. We had this really cool conversation, and that always stuck with me. And I could see him that part of his personality, even like online when he interacts with folks, like on Facebook. And that's just
Yeah.
a really endearing, quality that he has.
Well, I will say this, like I think I'm pastoring a church now with a lot of people. Like I would say biggest group of our church are people who are deconstructing and people who are in some way like rethinking what do I believe about church? What do I believe about God? And most of their experiences are in these really dogmatic evangelical spaces. And in some ways I can really relate to that, but in some ways like my house was a place where it was always okay to question, it was always okay to wrestle. I remember really clearly me just questioning the idea of if the devil was a real thing and just making no sense. I remember going to my dad and saying like, "Listen, it's like telling your kids you can't eat cookies and then putting the cookie monster in there and saying he's going to convince you to eat these cookies. Like it doesn't make sense to me." And I remember
Right.
saying, Dad, do you have to believe in the devil and hell and all this stuff to be a Christian?" And he said, "No." And I remember that feeling like, okay, I didn't expect you to say that. Like I thought you would be like really dogmatic about you have to believe all these things. And so I think it's interesting. My mom came from a Southern Baptist upbringing, so she like has this whole like love of the Bible and love of evangelism and all these things. And a little bit, maybe a lean towards a little bit of that dogma. But my dad grew up as this agnostic Jew in New York. And I think they really balanced each other out and like gave me this experience of like, here's what we believe is true. And here's like these big rocks that like death and resurrection of Jesus and, the Trinity. But there's a lot of room to play. And, even as like I remember going to Sunday school and learning about 7-day creation and all those things. I remember my parents being like, well, you can form your own thoughts about that. And so, yeah, that was my parents were maybe had their own thoughts and maybe some of them leaned a little bit more conservative, but and even the way they pastored was a way that was like, um, really this big tent center set. Like we're all coming to Jesus. These other little details, they might matter, but they don't matter as much as these big things.
Yeah, and I felt that because, my former in-laws obviously
Mhm.
attended your parents' church, and so as a result, on a lot of different family events, I would end up going as well, and always just felt like the vibe in that church is just one of humility, of gentleness, and that's one thing I always really enjoyed about it is it didn't feel, overly big and flashy, and, it did feel very much like the more of the Vineyard history that I read about and how it started and how, how originally it was not flashy. They didn't want that. It was
No.
like hippies from like the Jesus movement who are like, we just want to baptize on the beach, man, and meet in living rooms. And I'm like, that's the kind of vibe. If you can kind of, pull the essence out of that and put it into a church form, that's the vibe I got at your parents' church every single time.
Well, it was cool. I got the opportunity to end up working at that church as a pastor for about 5 years. And it was really cool just to be able to, as my dad was retiring and as my mom passed away, but like her last years in ministry, to kind of sit under their leadership and learn from them. But one of the cool things we would always hear was people would come to that church from, maybe other vineyards and say, oh, this feels like the vineyard that I remember, or this feels you know, like a real vineyard or something, whatever that means. But we would always hear stuff like that.
That's interesting, and that's something that we'll definitely come back to as we talk. Just sort of the evolution of the vineyard over the years, and you remember from way back. You were recounting, I think the Columbus Vineyard, if memory serves, it was like Rich Nathan kind of kicked it off in like 87 or mid 80s, somewhere around there. And so if you remember like the time that predates that, you're really talking about sort of the beginning of the vineyard as we know it today. Wimber, I think, took over in like 82. And
Hmm.
so really behind his vision, sort of like really exponentially grew the vineyard over like the 90s and early
Yeah.
2000s. You see this sort of outward explosion. So like for you to have that perspective of remembering sort of like the early days, I think is really important to the story that I'm trying to tell
Hmm.
podcast. So probably a good transition. So talk about sort of, one of the things I got, this will kind of lead me into my question. One of the pieces, the vibe I got from a lot of the pastors who had been around the vineyard for a long time, like the Ken Wilsons, who one of the early folks who kind of jumped on board, and
Hmm.
even Ryan Bowers from out in Duluth, talking about sort of the differences in how the influences or the vineyard sort of I don't know the word I'm trying to look for, sort of the way the vineyard was sort of headed, their direction, their vision maybe sort of changed depending on the leader at the time. And so obviously under the Wimber years, like very clear, everything was sort of funneled through Wimber's vision. And so there's a very distinct sort of flavor. And then unfortunately he passes away tragically from a battle with cancer in I think the mid 90s.
Yeah.
So then you have a movement that he grew, that's now international, a brand, if you want to call it that. And then
Yeah.
you've got somebody who's got to step in and fill in his shoes. And then at some point, you kind of have to realize that, like, all right, he's gone. Now we need to figure out, based on today and where we're at, what does the vineyard want to be? What does that look like? So talk about sort of maybe the transition from the Wimber years to sort of the aftermath of his death. Like from inside the vineyard, what did that feel like, first of all? And like, did you notice any sort of changes in terms of the vision or the move towards certain things after that?
Think are you frozen right now? Or am I
I'm not,
frozen?
but I think no, you're
Okay,
moving.
cool. Okay, good.
You're good.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember really clearly when Wimber passed, and as an adult now, looking back at it, I do not envy anyone who had to fill those shoes. I mean, he Wimber was so beloved, and really, like, I got to talk to him as a little kid, but like he was just such an influential person and had so much charisma and had so much vision. And I mean, if you look through church history, like the idea of the founding person of a movement passing it on to the next person is like the make or break thing. And I do remember, like, there was like the Todd Hunter years and the Burt Wagner years and the Phil Strout years and now the Jay Pathick years. And like with each of the leader, it did have a slightly different feel. There would be different things that the Vineyard would try. And kid, some of the things were noticeable. Like I remember, I don't remember who did it, but at one point they stopped inviting kids to the national conference. And I was so bummed about that. But I do remember this shift of like one of the things that was such a key thing in my experience with the Vineyard was this dial down. No one's a rock star. No one is you know, we're not trying to platform people. We're trying to like everybody gets to play. That was like one of the phrases that still gets used. But John Wimber, he wouldn't do the ministry from the front. He would, like, when it came to like time to lay hands on people, he would leave and have children come up and pray for people or anyone. So it was this idea of empowering everyone. And I remember slowly starting to feel a slight change from that, where there started to be people, and maybe this is my perspective as a kid becoming an adult, but it started to feel like there was platforms where people were being kind of elevated because they were really gifted speakers or they were really gifted musicians or whatever it was. Like early days of the Vineyard, like I remember you wouldn't have like the names of the worship leaders on the covers of the albums. And because John Wimber was like, we're not trying to create rock stars. And I always, like, for me, I really appreciated that. And so now slowly, and I don't know if it's at the fault of the national leader. I don't think it is. I think it's just kind of the evolution of how things happened in uh American Christianity. There's this thing of platforming gifted people and talented people. I do remember that. I remember Vineyard Columbus, which was where I grew up, went from a place where it was, a couple hundred people to being a church of thousands. And in a church of thousands, you have to do things differently. And I remember those conversations overhearing my parents have and stuff about like, how do we keep that like energy of we are just a local church, we are a community of people, but also, do a Sunday morning service for 10,000 people. So you started to see these platforms and these people starting to get elevated, but that would go, there would be ebbs and flows of that. Most of my ministry experience within the Vineyard was as a worship leader. And I just had always loved some of the leaders, the national leaders within the worship community, really tried really hard to keep it that place where we're not rock stars. We're ministers. We're loving people. And so I remember one time bringing my like 19-year-old intern to one of these worship gatherings and watching her sit with someone who is like, she had no idea, but like, written some of the biggest worship songs in, the history of like modern worship, contemporary worship. And they're just sitting down talking like contemporaries. And that's one of the things that like was always part of the thread within the Vineyard. But over recent years, you started to see this vein of it becoming more in line with a lot of the evangelical spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that, because that's definitely throughout the last year, of researching and looking into like the history and sort of the players involved. It definitely feels as if that was not, even though like you could argue that Wimber largely built an empire, out of the Vineyard, it never struck me as that was his goal. Like his goal did not appear to be like, platforming was not the number one thing, like he was just trying to get what he thought was this experience, this personal experience that wasn't found in traditional churches, out to as many people as possible.
Yeah, and to Wimber's credit, like he was a celebrity but he really tried to do things to make it so he wasn't the center of attention.
Yeah, yeah, you definitely get that vibe. And you can see why, I was watching some videos of his sermons and some of his personal story, and I found myself like in the in my office basement cackling to myself because
Yeah.
he's funny, really
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah.
And like tells an amazing story and just you can see the charisma and why people were drawn to him and just what a gifted public speaker is. Just I mean his conversion story is hilarious.
Yeah, it's the best. Like I still like I haven't watched it for a couple years, but I'll still watch it and be like, it's inspiring and funny and like it's like, yeah, that's what I signed up for. That's what I want to do. Like I want to do
Yeah.
the stuff that Jesus did.
Yeah, yeah. When do we get to do the stuff? That's.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the things that's interesting about what you mentioned though is, there definitely seems to be this pattern where, it's again, it's impossible to pin it on a particular national leader or any one person, but it feels like you're right. Like there were some changes within the evangelical world. There are a lot of newer kids on the block, we'll say,
Mhm.
a lot of like movements that sort of occurred after the Vineyard. Vineyard very much felt like the pioneer in the evangelical world. They were largely the first movement that was really writing. They clearly didn't invent worship music, but they definitely, perfected it in many ways. And the Vineyard publishing arm was huge. I mean, early night or late 90s, early 2000s, you couldn't go to an evangelical church, not just Vineyard, but an evangelical church in the United
Yeah,
States and not hear a Vineyard worship.
absolutely.
But now, yeah, you fast forward like 20, 30 years and it's like then the Hillsongs popped up and there's the Bethels out in California, who are all making some awesome worship music. And so Vineyard isn't like, like the one cool kid on the block anymore. And so it makes you wonder, it's like, because I do, you do hear a lot of like folks who are still like, old school guys within the Vineyard who are still sort of pining for the glory days, and you
Yeah,
kind of,
absolutely.
yeah.
Well,
So, yeah.
one of the things with that is another thing I really respected was the Vineyard, like when those like the Hillsongs and the Bethels and Passion and some of those other big worship movements were going along, like those places would pump like millions of dollars into promoting artists and songs and albums. And I remember the Vineyard being like, we're not interested in doing that. Like we're not and so like some of the people were pining for the time where the Vineyard was still like the people who were putting out the songs that everybody was singing, but it had just changed. And so like I believed at that time the Vineyard was still writing good music and doing good things, but it was just like that's not what we do. And so that was I always really really loved. And the other thing I was going to say is some of the change happened too. Like I pastor a church right now that's under 100 people. And so like the difference between pastoring a church of under 100 people and pastoring a church of, 500 people is very different. And so the Vineyard went from this movement that was like, 20 churches or 60 churches, and then to this thing that was like, we're like 600 churches, and the leadership dynamics never really changed. So they're like, we have to figure out how we can do this differently now that we're not a small, like 20-person or 20 church movement, but we're like hundreds of churches. And so a lot of the changes that started to happen was due to the growth.
Yeah, that's a good place to start talking about that. So what are some of the things that they implemented over the years as they realized like, hey, we're not just this small network of churches anymore. We're like this huge international presence. And when you're sort of juggling that many churches, it becomes something that's beyond just licensing out a name, and allowing this church to use the Vineyard name. There's got to be some level of oversight, and
Hmm.
making sure that, hey, this local church is representing the Vineyard at large in a positive way. So what were
Yeah.
some of the things that you started to see implemented over time?
Well, so they tried lots of different things over the years, and some of the things stuck and some of the things didn't stick. But most of my experience as a pastor was they started having these official places of leadership. So my dad, for instance, was a regional leader. And so he like oversaw the Great Lakes region of the Vineyard. But you use the word oversaw very loosely because those positions were positions of accountability and oversight and shepherding, but there was really no actual authority that they had. The Vineyard was always about the autonomy of the local church. So I remember there would be situations where a church would be like doing things that maybe weren't immoral or wrong, but just not Vineyard, quote unquote. And people would come to my dad and say, you got to do something about it. And sometimes it'd be like, I mean, I can talk to him, but I can't really do anything about it. And so I think people wanted, I mean, the Vineyard for the most part was a bunch of like pastors who had this pioneer spirit who liked the independence until it became something where it was like, you got to do something about that church that's, not being Vineyard. And then they wanted structure and oversight. So they tried these things. Like we had area leaders who were like over like maybe like 5, 6 churches. And then you had these regional leaders who were over like a bunch of different areas. And depending on which area and region you were in, the oversight looked. So within Ohio, the Vineyard was a pretty well-oiled machine where, the areas got along really well for the most part and hung out, and there would be like monthly meetings, and then the region would do these regional, get-togethers, but there really wasn't any official accountability. It was all like just relational accountability. And so I think, well, no, I don't think, I know, about 4 or 5 years ago, there started to be these conversations of we need to shift that. Like we need to have it not just be relational, hey, we think maybe this would be a good idea, but something official. Like, and I just know as a vineyard, by that point, I was pastoring my own church, and there was everybody had different thoughts on that. Because some people were like, "Oh yes, finally we can have real accountability," and other people were like, "Wait a second, like this is not what I signed up for." So I think trying different things of like relational accountability over the years, in some instances really worked, in some instances it didn't work.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think that's too dissimilar from some older denominations who have been around a lot longer. I was talking to my pastor recently, who happens to be an ELCA Lutheran pastor, and they've been around for a little over 500 years. So doing it for a little while, but even in that space, he's like, look, like not everything works, not everything's perfect, even in older. I mean,
Mhm.
obviously, like we saw the issues with sexual abuse within the Catholic Church, the
Mhm.
oldest, uh, you know,
Yeah.
and so even with, we were talking about this before we got started, even places that have like very rigid structure are still susceptible to these sorts of things happening. So there is no real perfect system.
Yeah, and sometimes the rigid structure can even be worse. Like it really depends on, to me, we were talking about it earlier, like I don't think you can stop bad things from happening. And sometimes the bad things happen because of the rigid structure, and sometimes the bad things happen because there's no structure. And so it's really difficult. I think creating systems in churches is really difficult because, power corrupts people, and power, like I know, even as a person who goes up on a stage every week, that stage can do something to your heart if you're not careful. And so unchecked power is so I mean, you see the Mars Hills and the stuff like that, but checked power, like when you start creating these systems of leadership, that's so dangerous too, because then there's like you see these cover-ups and these like uh yeah, centralized leadership, I don't know if is the answer either. So, like, I think so many people, including myself in the church, especially in this kind of post evangelical world, are like really trying to rethink, like, what does leadership look like? Like, how do we do leadership in a way that's decentralized, but also where there's actual accountability and people who are gonna, protect the weakest and the most marginalized. So I mean, I think the Vineyard is in a very tricky place right now. And I don't envy Jay trying to figure out what to do, because I don't know if there's a right answer. Just to play my cards, I don't know if Jesus ever intended the church to be these large denominations or movements with all of these brands and power structures. So, like, I think I'm kind of at the point right now where I'm like, I don't know if I ever want to be a part of something like that again, even if it looks really good, because I just think that the system of the power system is broken to begin with.
Yeah, on a personal level, I would not disagree with anything you just said.
Mhm.
um, And I think the place I've gotten to and just kind of comparing and contrasting like similar situations to like what happened in Duluth is, yeah, I mean, there is probably no good way to ever prevent any bad thing from ever happening. I think the best we can do is we need to put systems in place, or at least reporting mechanisms in place
Yes.
to prevent as much of it as possible,
Yeah.
and then also have a response that honors the victims and is effective in the aftermath of something, God forbid, if something does happen.
Absolutely. I think, well, with all that I said, I think there are a lot of ways that you can try to do it well. And I don't think there's one way to do it, but there are definitely a lot of ways that you shouldn't do it. And I think, you know, a lot of what I've seen recently are ways that you shouldn't do it. You know, yeah, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
No, I mean that's right, kind of where I wanted to go because you look at certain things that you always kind of hindsight is always 2020. It's like, well, what could we have done to prevent that from happening? And I know that's a question that's been asked, ad nauseum within the members of the Duluth community who, were shocked and taken back by after everything was sort of revealed. I know Chris Souter who came on
Mhm.
asks himself that every day, like, what could I have done differently? And ultimately, it's like, it's no one person's fault for what happened. There's a series of events that created the perfect storm. Like you look at the situation where, like John Kluwer, who who was one of the instrumental people in bringing this whole situation to light, saw the need for a nepotism policy. But ultimately, Michael took it to the board and got them to vote for exemptions for both him and Brenda. So it's like there you have sort of a failsafe that they saw a need to have, but was ultimately overridden, and so could not do its job effectively. And then you have some other things that could have been put in place. Like, why in the world does Vineyard USA not have a third party reporting system? Like, if you're going to operate like a corporation, corporations have HR departments, man. Like
Huh.
I think we lost JT.
I lost you for this. Hey, can you hear me? I think I lost you for a second, but are you back? Am I back? Hello.
Uh-oh. We'll see if he comes back.
I am here. Can you hear me? Hello, hello. Hey, can
There.
you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know what. Yeah. Sorry, Ben.
That's all right. So what I was saying is like, I was just kind of talking about the fact that like some simple other things that could have been implemented that may have helped to stop this from happening. It's like, when you act like a corporation, then you have to have corporate fail-safes put in place. And from a corporate perspective, my day job, it's like there are certain things that they have in place to prevent similar things from happening in the workplace. If we had any issue with a manager being abusive in any way, shape, or form, I can file an HR complaint that goes to an HR department that is
Yeah.
anonymous, and there's retaliatory, protections put in place. And ultimately they'll look into it. And if there's credence to it, then there are, things that, actions that take place after that. But Vineyard clearly didn't have that at least at the time that the Duluth things were happening. A lot of these reports, and there were reports going back decades,
Hmm.
that were ultimately just sort of cycled back to the perpetrators, so like, yeah, and then you're dealing with a nepotism issue with the fact that, like, with Jackson specifically, his bosses are his parents. And so, like, we have parents that reportedly went to Brenda and were like, "Hey, your son was doing this." So there's that inherent conflict of interest. And so, um, interesting to get your take because I know you're also coming from a particular situation where you had parents who are both in co-leadership, and that is obviously a very prevalent thing within Vineyard. I did a random sampling the other day just out of curiosity because I'm not coming from as a good Lutheran boy. It's not uncommon to have larger churches that have more than one pastor, but it's almost never like a husband and wife.
Yeah.
So I thought that was kind of unique and unusual, and so I looked at 40 random churches. I just pulled up 40 random churches, and out of 40 random Vineyard churches I pulled up in various areas of the country, over half were led by.
Interesting.
And I thought, okay, so then what sort of mechanisms do they have in place to ensure that there's accountability? And I come to find out that not everybody has a board. Those that do have a board vary significantly in size from like a handful of people to larger boards. Oftentimes the pastor themselves are on the board. I'm like, how do you hold
Hmm.
yourself accountable?
Hmm.
So, like, talk about that. Like, what is there any sort of coherency, between churches? No, you're shaking your head no.
No, No, like I mean that the joke was always like if you've gone to one Vineyard church, you've gone to one Vineyard church because it's like and some of that was because of that big tent, where there's the autonomy of the local church. But I mean, as someone who planted a church, I can tell you the system for starting a new Vineyard church is nothing. Like there's like no formal training. The only thing that they make you do is they give you this assessment, which was helpful. And then they have your regional leader sign off on it. But the reality is most regional leaders don't know the person. There's not like a formal interview process. There's not formal like, hey, we want you to even take these 4 classes. It's like whatever. If they say you're good, you're good. And to me, that's one of the biggest issues is that like even if you don't say here are the things that we want you to put in your bylaws, like here are the things that here's how people can report, abuse or whatever. There's not even any training on how to handle that stuff anyways, or how to write bylaws or how to like, do any of that stuff or how to, handle a budget with integrity or any of that stuff. It's just kind of like this, throw you out to the wolves and see if you survive. And for some people, like in some ways for me, that was okay. Like I felt like I had so much experience in church. I had worked in churches for like, 15 years and grew up like with parents who worked in churches. But there's still things that like for me that I'm like, gosh, I wish someone would have sat down and like helped me with this or like shown me how to do these things. So I think one of the problems isn't that you have like immoral, pastors who are trying to like, do things so they can have all the power. Like they probably just don't know that they shouldn't be on the board, or they probably don't know that there should be mechanisms in place. And so, yeah, I think that's been a lot of the problem is that the Vineyard has always worked on this like relational level. So it's like if I as a pastor believe in you, I am going to platform you or I'm going to give you opportunity. And in some ways, that's great. In some ways, I love that. That's because that's how someone looked at me and said, I want to give you an opportunity. But then at the same time, when there are issues of moral failures. Like if it's all done on the buddy system, there is this, I don't think that person would do that. I know that person and they're my friend. And then you circle the wagons and protect each other. And I don't think that's a Vineyard problem. I think that's a humanity problem. And I just think the Vineyard for a long time didn't really address that. So yeah, there are those things like, and I know like even as a pastor whose parents were pastors, when I ended up working at my parents' church, they took a vote, and the only person who voted against it was my dad. And that was a little hurtful, but it was really because of that. He was just thought, I believe in JT and I think he's gifted, but I don't want it to feel like nepotism. And I don't want people to feel like he got this job because of me. Uh, yeah, again, that goes back to like the character of my dad.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. I think there's all of these vineyards who are these lone wolves who don't know what they're doing. And most of them have a good heart. Like most vineyard pastors I know love Jesus, love the kingdom, love people, and I don't think we're adequately set up to pastor a church.
Great segue, JT, into what they're trying to do now.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that a little bit because just from an outsider's perspective, and I do think it's super helpful that to their credit, Vineyard USA posts a lot of stuff on their website. And so from the inordinate amount of metrics that they track, which I found interesting, I was like, oh, this feels very corporate to me, to their new handbook that they're rolling as a result of some of these things that have happened in both Duluth and even in Anaheim. Definitely probably time for some sort of unified handbook. So I was like, awesome, let's take a look at it. And I'm reading through it. And as a former procedure writer myself in my day job, I was like, there's a lot of ambiguity in here, which feels problematic when you use it to enforce anything. And so you and I were talking about this briefly before we started recording. I just want to get your take on it. And yesterday was interesting too, because I wanted to meet with my pastor, not because I feel like ELCA Lutherans do it better than everyone, because they have their own problems, but just from the perspective of like, I want to talk to somebody who comes from, a tradition that's been doing this for a minute, and sort of compare and contrast sort of the handbook that they have and some of the structures they have in place to what Vineyard has or is at least attempting to do, and sort of kind of take a look at both. So here are a couple things that I notated.
Yeah, please.
So in regards to, I found that first of all, and I want to get your take on this too, my personal perception on it was this handbook feels very much like they took one of the recommendations between the Grace Report and the Guidepost Report and really ran hard with it, but it didn't appear as if they really implemented a lot of the other recommendations. And so the one recommendation that it felt like they really spent a great deal of time on is formal ordination. Was that your perception as well?
Yes. Yeah.
So within that, it feels like there's two halves to what they have in the handbook as it pertains to formal ordination. The first part is really sort of outlining what they're going to do in regards to those who are already formally in a role as pastor, and asking them really to attest to it. And then there's the second half, which is, here are the criteria that you will be required to meet in order to be considered for ordination if down the road you want to become a Vineyard pastor. So I thought that was interesting. So starting with sort of the things that they're sort of committing to, what I found interesting was it's a lot of sort of phrasing that indicates this is what we'll do down the road. And yet what was interesting to me is that they're also, they're committing to do certain things, but they haven't outlined how they're going to do it. And they're asking current pastors to attest to it, which I found interesting. So, for example, they said they will develop, articulate, and evaluate standards for ordination. Well, yeah, that seems like a good idea. And maybe you might want to outline those first before I attest to what that is. But that's it. That's literally the line in there with no additional detail on how they intend to do this.
Yeah, and that was what I gathered from that too. And it wasn't surprising, because I feel like there's been a lot of that recently of like, hey, we want to tidy things up and we want to add structure to this stuff. And when people say, okay, that sounds great, what is the structure? It's kind of like, well, just trust us. It's going to be good. And are you for the structure? Do you want to sign off on that structure? And you're like, well, I will once you tell me what it is. So I just remember there's this things like, I remember reading this thing that said that you have to agree with the written and unwritten values of the Vineyard. And you're like, wait, what are the unwritten? Yeah, like, what is that? Like, if you can tell me what those things are, then I can know if I support that. And so honestly, I have no problem with national ordination or centralized ordination, but I just want to know what those standards are before and to be clear, let me just say this too. I'm no longer a Vineyard pastor. And so I don't know if that would be helpful to talk about that. So my opinion on it is as someone who was an insider. So I haven't been privy to all the conversations and all the information, but from what I've seen, is it just feels like and I don't know if this is intentional, but it feels like, trust us. Like, are you for this? Okay, just tell us you're for it, and then we'll tell you what it is.
Yeah, and that's kind of the indication that others who are still within the movement have expressed like some concern over. They're like, look, I don't feel comfortable signing on to this because there's so much vagueness in it. So another example is they said, we will establish programs, partnerships, and training resources that will support pastors in their journey to ordination and beyond. And yet nowhere in the handbook does it list like, so what have you established? Like, what are those programs?
What is that?
What does that look like? And then even more problematic, in my opinion, is they get down to the part of I don't think that too many people would argue that like this is a mechanism that probably should be in place, right? So like if you're a Vineyard pastor and you're representing the Vineyard and you do something horrific, like perhaps covering up a sexual assault might qualify, that they should be able to revoke your ordination. I mean, other denominations do it. Mm-hmm. There's a process, again, within the Lutheran Church where, if charges are brought against you, the bishop comes in and you've got two choices. You can either, resign or you can refuse, at which point they can kick you out, And so that probably is a good idea. But what it says is they're going to implement processes to revoke the credentials of an ordained Vineyard pastor who is found to be in substantial violation of the ordination standards. Well, we just established that we don't know what the ordination standards necessarily are. And then how do they define things like substantial?
Yeah.
Yeah. And who determines if that level of substantial has been met? It doesn't outline any of that stuff.
Yeah. Well, and even also to throw another wrench in it, like the idea in the past was, I do agree with you that it feels like it makes sense to say if someone is doing something that is against the values of this movement, we can remove them. But it goes back to this larger question of who has authority over the local church. Is it the pastor who says you can kick our church out of the movement, or you can take me out of position of this church? And so a lot of people, and gosh, I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know what's better, because to me, I feel like if someone comes to me and says, I think you have substantially, I don't know how you exactly worded it, but went against our values, and I disagree with it, I don't know if I want the Vineyard to have the power to say, we're going to put a different pastor in charge of this church that I have felt like I have walked with and shepherded, and so who is the are we autonomous local churches, or are we part of this larger central thing? And I think that's the main question right now with a lot of these bylaws and changes that they're trying to make with this guidebook.
The views and experiences expressed in this episode are those of the individual speaking and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of any affiliated organizations or institutions. All individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know has experienced abuse or misconduct, please know that you are not alone, and there are resources linked in the show notes to support you.
If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences, and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity, and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently, too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.